Before we get to this week's episode, this is just a reminder that if you sign up to my email list by going to go.nonmonogamyhelp.com/email, you do automatically get sent a coupon code that you can use for the Anxious Person's Guide to Non-Monogamy on the Jessica Kingsley Publishers website. And they do ship to North America and to Europe, as far as I know, also all around the world, but do feel free to join the email list and get that coupon in case you want to get the book, but you want to get a little bit of money off. All right, this is this week's episode.
Non-Monogamy Help is a podcast where your questions about open, non-monogamous or polyamorous relationships are answered. Our host, Lola Phoenix, will consult a licensed therapist with over a decade of experience to address your problems. Names and locations have been changed or censored to keep your questions anonymous. You're listening to Non-Monogamy Help, the podcast.
Hello, and welcome to episode 107 of the Non-Monogamy Help podcast. I'm Lola Phoenix. Please send your questions to ask@nonmonogamyhelp.gmail or ask@nonmonogamyhelp.com. Excellent. And they'll either be in the podcast or the column anonymously. If you want to read the columns and listen to the podcast, you can find everything at nonmonogamyhelp.com. And if you subscribe to the email newsletter, you can do that by going to go.nonmonogamyhelp.com/email. That will get you all the podcasts and the columns in your inbox every week. You can also follow Non-Monogamy Help on Twitter, as long as I guess that is still alive, and Instagram at Non-Monogamy Help. And if you want to support the columns and the podcast a little bit more, please consider becoming a patron. Even $1 helps me support the daily running of the columns and the podcasts, and it's just a nice general vote of support. I would super appreciate that. You can do that by going to patreon.com/Lola Phoenix. And if you donate $5 or more a month, your name with your permission will be read at the end of the podcast. All right. Let's get to this week's discussion question. If this is the first time you're hearing this, every week before I read the letter, I put forth a discussion question that you can use with your friends, partners, or anyone else to get to know them a little bit more. I also answer it myself briefly to give you a little bit of context. This week's discussion question is, how did your parents' relationships impact how you do relationships? So this is like a big discussion question. This isn't very quick or easy to answer, but I do think that it's actually quite important, because for the vast majority of us, unless there's some sort of circumstance that I'm unaware of, which is possible, our parents' relationships and the first kind of models that we saw of love have a direct impact on how we kind of expect things to go, and how we're treated by our parents and our siblings and other early people in our lives do have a direct impact on that. So I think it's always interesting to kind of explore how that might impact what you consider to be normal later on in life. And for me, this is a very big question, which I'll get a little bit more into in the episode today. But yeah, I think that for me, the idea that you should kind of stick it out has always been a thing that I think is a good thing in some ways. Like, I'm really glad that I'm not a person who gives up when things get difficult in relationships, but at the same time, I do feel like it gets to a certain point where you're like, okay, things are difficult, they're not getting any better, when to say when, right? And I think that that has been a little bit more difficult for me, and more of a difficult lesson to learn because of some of the things that I witnessed in my parents' relationship. So the question, again, is, how did your parents' relationships impact the way you do relationships today? All right, let's get to this week's letter. I'm a cishet woman in my 30s, married to a cishet man for 13 years, together for 16. About a year ago, I brought the idea of non-monogamy to my husband, and he initially agreed, though it was reluctant. The past year has been incredible for me as far as personal growth and realizations about myself and my sexuality. My husband's experience has not been the same. He has met multiple women and has a stable friend with benefits of 6 to 7 months, so that isn't his complaint. He struggles with intense anxiety and jealousy, fears that I'm trying to leave him, and has has lashed out at me verbally in his hurt and anger. He read your book as a resource, actually. We've been in couples counseling for 4 months, and I'm also seeing an individual counselor. He has said to me that he doesn't feel non-monogamy is something that he can do forever. I'm not willing to go back to monogamy with him. In fact, I'd actually prefer polyamory as a relationship structure moving forward. Worse, I feel like I have lost the love I once had for him. We do have 2 school-age children, and trying to keep their lives stable is the main thing holding me back from seriously considering divorce. So I would appreciate your perspective on if my marriage can be saved, and is this worth trying to save? Before we get to this week's answer, we have a quick advertisement from BetterHelp. Quite often, a lot in my columns and my podcasts, I encourage people to seek a polyamory-friendly therapist or a therapist who has some understanding of polyamory. And for a lot of people, that's not really easy to find locally. So if you're looking for a place where you can find therapists online, you can send messages to at any time of the day, and they do offer a little bit of financial aid. If you can look it up, you can get 10% off your first month by going to betterhelp.com/non-monogamy help or using the promo code non-monogamy help at checkout. Let's get to this week's answer. So the first thing that I kind of want to challenge here is the idea that I feel like is very understandable to have, because it's very much ingrained into our culture and our society, and it's a big thing, right? And that is the idea that it is better for a child to have 2 parents who are married and together than to have parents who are divorced. And this is kind of a gross oversimplification of the issue, because there isn't really anything stable about 2 people who are pretending to be in a relationship or trying to be in a relationship that doesn't work. Like, that isn't actually very stable for the child. And this is kind of why I asked the discussion question beforehand, because from my personal perspective, and not to give too much of a background of my history to distract from the issue, but my mom came out when I was 2, and she stayed with my dad, who treated her very, very badly from what I gather and what she's told me, for a number of years. And they weren't really together. And it was something that I felt growing up that sort of normalized a kind of coldness in relationships to me. I don't think it was actually good for them to stay together, especially because the quote unquote family that they were trying to preserve wasn't very stable to begin with. And to be fair, my mom was quite young when she made this decision, and there's lots of complicated things about that decision. I don't necessarily blame her for that decision, but the idea that it is better for a child to have 2 parents who are married and in this sort of picket fence beaver, leave it to beaver, I don't know. That idea I don't think is actually very true. Obviously, a big change to a child's life in terms of their living situation can be difficult for them to adapt to, because what children tend to need, from what I gather, I'm not a parenting expert, but what children tend to need is stability and consistency. So a big change is going to make things a little bit difficult for them, but I don't actually think that is that difficult if the 2 parents involved in the situation are stable and consistent people in that child's life. So I feel like, yes, divorce is difficult. Changes to routine are difficult, especially when you sort of take in the fact that I feel like there's a little bit less stigma now for people to have divorced parents. It's a little bit more normal, but that is a kind of thing that they may need to work through. And you can provide support for your children through that. You can provide them with therapy if you're able. You can be a consistent person, and hopefully your partner would also continue to be a consistent person that will consistently bring them love and support. And I think that would be fine. I don't think that it is necessarily so important to maintain this almost facade in some ways in order to give your child a quote unquote stable life. And the assumption is that lying and that facade is stability when it's not. That said, I feel like there is a little bit kind of a complicated thing going on here, because yes, you feel like you want polyamory going forward. He isn't sure if he wants non-monogamy going forward. And I feel like he's only been in therapy for like 4 months. He's had a friends with benefits situation for 6 months. Relatively, if you kind of compare how long you've been together monogamously versus how long you've been together in a non-monogamous situation, it's not really the same. And I feel like it's kind of like if you were to move to a new town, right? Or you were to move to a city and maybe you've been in the country for the vast majority of your life. And for the first 4 to 6 months of that, you were really struggling and really like, oh God, I want to go back home. This is horrible. Why did I do this? You might hesitate to just completely abandon the decision so early because yeah, sometimes when you make a big change and a big shift, you have big emotions about it in the exact same way that your children would have big emotions about big changes. Like all human beings, regardless of their age and where they are at, when something big changes in their life, it causes a lot of fear. It causes a lot of anxiety. That is actually quite normal, regardless of whatever kind of emotional resiliency a person has. It's very normal and understandable to have all of this anxiety. I don't know is that big decisions need to be made right now. I do think that it's worth keeping in mind that there is a possibility that you could be incompatible and not making decisions from a standpoint of protecting children from experiencing the divorce. I don't think that should be the main motivator of the decision. I think that the main motivator of the decision should be whether or not this is something that's workable for you both, something that makes you both happy. And it might be a little bit too soon to call right now. So you said that he read my book in terms of like using that as a resource. And the things that I'm kind of wondering here are, one of the first things that I ask people if they're interested in non-monogamy, but they don't really know if it's something that they want or aren't really sure is, could you be in a monogamous relationship with someone who is gone a lot of the time for a time-intensive career or time-intensive hobby? Because at the core fundamental basis, the difference between monogamy and non-monogamy is that your partner or partners are not going to be spending 100% of their time with you. And that is the thing that I think people often don't really consider or think about, or that is the thing that becomes difficult for a lot of people to deal with. And even within monogamy, not everybody can date someone who is, let's say, a lawyer and isn't home for a lot of the time. So I think that that's kind of the first thing that needs to be looked at. Like, could you actually deal with a situation like that? Because that is the physical reality of the situation you'll be dealing with if you agree to non-monogamy. The second thing is my concept of the anchor, which I explore in the book. So does he have an anchor? Does he have a personal reason for being interested in non-monogamy? Now, he's expressed that he's not sure if this is something he wants to do forever. Is that based upon the fact that he's going through a lot of emotions right now and, dealing with the fact that he's in a different style of a relationship? He doesn't have any social models for that relationship in the way that he did in monogamy, and is understandably very concerned with the idea of losing you. All of those are very, very rational emotions. And it makes sense for him to be like, I don't know if I want to feel this way forever, but he may not actually feel that way forever. So is he noticing a change in his feelings? Is he noticing a shift? Is the counselor saying anything about this? Like, have you talked to the counselor about this? I think that it's worth continuing along this path together, especially since, like, he does have other partners, so it's not necessarily an issue of him being unwilling or in denial about the situation. He's not in denial. But it's understandable for him to kind of still have big feelings, still have big emotions, still have a lot of kind of, exactly the same as the example that I gave. If you moved to a different city, if you left all of your family and friends behind, and sometimes in non-monogamy, this does feel like that, because you are leaving behind an entire kind of social safety net in a way. You are going off the path of a sort of prescriptive narrative that society has given you of, okay, you get married, you have kids, this is the way, the path to happiness. You are deviating from that path and you are going into territory that is unknown, and that does cause a lot of stress. And you don't necessarily have the ability to talk to all of the people in your life for support in the same way, or you can feel that way, because sometimes when you say, oh, like I'm struggling, and you're in an open relationship or you're in a non-monogamous relationship, a lot of people's responses to that, as supportive as they're trying to be, can be, well, you're in an open relationship, what do you expect? Like, it's similar in a lot of ways, in some instances, to being queer, like, and being, and that's why there is a queer community. That's why a lot of people really struggle, because even if they do have a supportive family, they're going down. I mean, it's a little less true now because we have more media examples of queer people. We have a lot more examples of queer relationships. But way back in the day, like, you're going off on a trajectory that society was actually actively telling you would lead to death and sadness and horrible things. So luckily, we don't tend to have that about non-monogamy. We don't tend to have these horror stories or as much awareness around it, but we do still kind of have this perception. I mean, if I guaranteed you, I've never seen a study done about this. So to be fair, this is like my own quantitative, what is it? Qualitative. I don't even know. I shouldn't even be trying to use fancy words. Like, look, this is my own kind of personal perception, obviously, but I feel like if you ask the vast majority of people about open relationships, their first concept of that is that it doesn't work. So you are going against a lot in your mind, a lot in your mind that's there to protect you, a lot in your mind that's, you haven't even been given the tools to see this as a potential. And I think also a lot of people forget that we spend a lot in our lives as children and young adults and teenagers imagining a future that is monogamous, and being given examples of relationships that are monogamous. And so we're kind of, when we're starting off in non-monogamy, we haven't had years and years and years to pontificate about what our lives might be like. So it is a very, very scary thing. It is a very new thing to come to grips with. It's very understandable, even if monogamy actually isn't that safe, even if we are kind of living in a assumption of safety within monogamy because of the society that we're in. And even though it's fully possible for somebody who has been married for 13 years to have their partner fall out of love with them and leave them within monogamy, it's still given a type of protection in your mind that you don't have in non-monogamy, and that takes a lot of adjusting. So I just feel like, yes, I do want you to come to terms with the idea that divorce isn't the worst case scenario for your children, that divorce between you two doesn't have to represent the worst thing to both of your children. As a person who grew up with parents who weren't really in love with each other, and more than just that, but, as a person who grew up with people who tried to stay together for the kids, I would very much encourage you to consider that two people who are really unhappy with each other can create more instability, even if they're physically in the same place for children, than two people who are happy and apart. And that is something that I definitely want you to consider. However, I don't think that necessarily means that you should break up and end everything right now just because he isn't sure that he wants to do non-monogamy forever. I mean, you're sure that you want to now. Things can change on both sides, and I have seen things change. So I think that making decisions right now based off of only a few months, really, of exploring this is a little hasty. I think that there's more talk that you both need to do. To summarize, I think that there's more talk that you both need to do with your counselor about things. I think that it's worth giving him some time and asking all these questions like, does he want to spend a relationship with someone who's not going to spend 100% of their time with him? He may not know right now. Does he have an anchor? Is he noticing a change in his feelings? You can continue along this path together and see where things go and see how things change. You could have an agreement. Like one time when I was dating somebody, I really, really wanted kids and they really, really didn't want kids. And I didn't necessarily want to end the relationship because I felt like it would be a good relationship. And because I was non-monogamous, there was the option of me potentially having kids with someone else. So I just thought, okay, I'm going to pursue this relationship and I'm going to check in 5 years and see where I'm at. I ended up changing my mind and not really sure if I wanted to have kids. So you never know how things are going to change. I don't think that if you have a solid relationship together, if you're both happy, the vast majority of the time, but this is obviously a struggle point, I don't necessarily think it's worth just abandoning everything right now. I think that you should hold off a little bit, find stability within the two of you in terms of like your own personal happiness, speak to your counselors a little bit more about what's going on. And he needs to explore some of these questions himself. And also both of you kind of talk about the reality that you may be incompatible in the long run and how you might deal with that. Maybe you're both happy in terms of how you want your lives to be, to consider being together with the understanding that you might break up when your kids reach a school age. I don't think it's necessarily a bad idea to stay together for the kids, but I do think that if you're both severely unhappy and if you both resent the decision and if you're both just doing it because you think that being together creates a stable environment, that's very different than going, okay, we're not so sure if we want to be together forever, but I think that we're happy together as we are. And for the most part, obviously, like no relationship is perfect, but for the most part, this relationship is fulfilling and worth continuing. And we can re-examine how we feel about the relationship structure in 5 years or in that certain amount of time. I think that's a little bit different. So yeah, I think that there's a few things to think about to work through with your therapist individually and as a couple, but I don't think it's necessarily at this point in time worth completely abandoning everything. So I hope that helps, and good luck. Thank you for listening to episode 107 of the Non-Monogamy Help podcast. If you want to be awesome, you can donate to my Patreon, donating $5 or more a month, or like whatever your local currency. Just go onto the site. I just say $5. But it means that your name, with your permission, of course, will be read at the end of the podcast. This week's current patrons are Laura Boylan, Chris Albury-Jones, Juke, Nikki Jones, James Wartell, Leo Yaki, Tyler Tigno, and Justin Calm. If for whatever reason you can't become a patron, because I get it, life happens and you don't necessarily, cost of living, things are difficult for some people out there, and that's absolutely fine. You can take 5 minutes, log into iTunes, find the podcast, rate and review it. You can also rate it on Spotify, apparently, although I can't really see how to do that from mine, but maybe it's because I'm not in America, whatever. You can do that if you would like. That would be super helpful. And it just helps me get the podcast out to new people, more ratings. I think somehow it gets higher up in some stuff. It's helpful. I appreciate it. And if you do leave me a rating, please let me know, because like I said before, I don't get any notifications about that, which is silly. And if you work for Apple, please tell them that I think it's silly. Anyway, thank you all for this week. You will get a new column next Friday and another podcast episode in a fortnight. Thank you so much for listening. You've been listening to Non-Monogamy Help. Our podcast music has been provided by Chris Albury-Jones at albury-jones.com, and the art was made by Dom Jung at domduong.com. Thank you for listening.